Long-term study reveals how childhood ADHD impacts adult mental health, cognition, and daily life. Well, we already know ADHD is primarily associated with dysfunction of executive function and pretty commonly associated with difficulty in regulating one's emotions. We throw around the term highly sensitive quite a bit, which is applicable, digestible, palatable. But learning some emotional regulation tools, I mean, it's beneficial across the board. It's just those with ADHD, like myself, may have to work at it a little more mindfully, effortfully. An 18-year follow-up study published in Psychiatry Research provides evidence that children diagnosed with ADHD tend to face broader challenges in adulthood across multiple areas of life compared to their peers. I'm saying compacted to their peers. Compared to their peers. Study evaluated adults who were diagnosed in childhood alongside their non-ADHD siblings in an unrelated control group. The findings indicate that siblings of children with ADHD generally experience typical adult functioning, suggesting that many long-term difficulties are specific to the condition itself rather than shared family upbringing. I would also suggest that, I'm sure they'll get into this when they identify like weaknesses of the study, because they always do, but the conversation about social masking, and, you know, just, we're social creatures by evolution. An adaptive coping trait that we may take on is learning how to practice being okay when we're not. Kind of maladaptive forms of self-accommodation. Being too ready to say yes at the compromise of our own well-being. Being too overly available, being too emotionally caught up in a situation that we don't need to give that much emotional investment to. Feigning disorganization, feigning organization, anything along those lines. I guess where I'm going with that is the cognitive effort associated with masking and portraying oneself as, say, like neurotypical is so draining. So I think that would, on the outside, present as if someone with ADHD is on the up and up. They're good at feigning and playing the role as neurotypical, but the very diminishing returns on that. ADHD, commonly, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, couldn't be more of a misnomer. As well, commonly known as ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition marked by ongoing patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. It's just not always outwardly observed. It's not always leg shaking. Sometimes it's more racing thoughts, anxious parts coming up for individuals. Cyrus, welcome in. Thank you for the streak. It affects roughly 5% to 70% of children worldwide, although it was once considered a condition that individuals outgrow. Scientists now recognize that symptoms often persist into adulthood. It was also, like in the 80s and 90s, kind of exclusively trained on identifying it as sex-specific, meaning they thought it only appeared in boys. Boy, were they wrong. It also hasn't been ADD since 2013. With new knowledge, so does the science change. Diagnoses, so on and so forth. Longitudinal studies track the same individuals over extended periods, allowing scientists to observe how childhood health conditions unfold over time. Past research suggests that adults who were diagnosed with ADHD as children may experience higher rates of mood disorders, lower educational attainment, and reduced job stability. However, many existing studies have focused primarily on clinical symptoms rather than examining broad daily functioning, such as physical health, sleep quality, and social relationships, which all, of course, matter. One of the study authors said, as part of my doctoral research, I had the opportunity to follow up a longitudinal cohort of children with ADHD, their siblings, and controls. This cohort has been followed throughout childhood, but their most recent comprehensive follow-up has taken place 10 years ago. Now that they've reached adulthood, we want to know We want to know how these children had grown up. While ADHD is known to be related to difficulties and impairment in childhood, much less is known about the long-term development of ADHD. Our aim was to investigate a broad range of aspects of daily functioning in adulthood among individuals who had been diagnosed with ADHD in childhood. You think of what's gained in adulthood too, outside of like a classroom setting and a family setting. You leave home, typically. You leave home. Some may go to college, some may not, but you do typically leave home after a certain age, after you age into early adulthood. You gain some agency, some autonomy, some independence from your family group, and you may learn how you function outside of other known systems where you had developed other systems of routine, which may make how one stays organized or manages their daily living activities a little more spiky than it would have been in a known controlled environment versus moving through new ones. But as brains change and as maturity develops and everything else, they like anybody else, will find systems that work for them. Are they always adaptive? Not necessarily. To better understand the origins and adult difficulties, researchers examined the biological family members of individuals with ADHD. Full siblings share approximately 50% of their inherent genetic material and typically grow up in similar home environments with the same parents. Evaluating siblings alongside individuals with ADHD allows researchers to separate genetic and environmental influences from risks directly linked to the diagnosis itself, and data supports now that it is likely inherited. It's likely a genetically inherited diagnosis, not dissimilar from autism spectrum disorder. Just because it's inherited doesn't mean it's always going to be expressed, and then of course one's lifespan development, access to resources, security in those resources, home, nutrition, education, psychologically safe parents, that kind of thing, is going to change the outward appearance of how observable that diagnosis may be for that person. And it's different, per individual. Authors evaluated data from an 18-year prospective study originating from a cohort in the Netherlands. The sample included 154 adults diagnosed with childhood ADHD, averaging 28.7 years of age. Almost 70% were female. 138 siblings without childhood ADHD. Notice it doesn't say they're necessarily neurotypical, just they don't have ADHD, so they may have depression, anxiety, anything else. 129 controls without a family history of ADHD. There we go. Both of those almost 30 years, and both of those almost 40% male. On average, researchers reevaluated participants 17.6 years after their initial inclusion in the study during childhood. To gather comprehensive data, participants completed self-reported online surveys and standardized clinical interviews over secure video calls. The latter of those is going to be more reliable. Participants also designated a close friend, partner, or parent to complete observer questionnaires to provide outside perspectives on daily behaviors. Good collateral. We love good collateral. The evaluation assessed 7 key areas of adult life: psychiatric status, behavioral and emotional problems, academic and professional history, daily adaptive functioning, neurocognitive performance, physical health, and healthcare usage. Statistical analysis revealed that adults diagnosed with childhood ADHD performed worse than control participants on over 60% of the measured outcomes. In terms of psychiatric status, 45% of participants in the childhood ADHD group met full diagnostic criteria for adult ADHD at follow-up. For what it's worth, in the DSM, there is no such thing as like adult ADHD. You just have ADHD. But I get where they're going with that for just like comparative analysis purposes. Major depressive disorder was diagnosed in 18% of adults with childhood ADHD. Yeah, mood disorders and anxiety disorders are very common. compared to 8% of controls and 6% of siblings. Children with ADHD are at an increased risk of challenges in adult functioning, including difficulties related to mental health, social functioning, and daily functioning. Notably, the risk of having a major depressive disorder in adulthood was greater for adults with childhood ADHD. Perhaps that toll of masking that I was mentioning earlier. It is draining. You have to heal when no one else is around in most cases. Behavioral assessment showed that adults who had childhood ADHD reported higher levels of externalizing problems as opposed to internalizing, or having a greater self, like locus of control, efficacy. We all try to attain efficacy. We may experience it intermittently at the best of times, which involve outward directed difficulties like impulsive or aggressive actions. They also reported higher levels of autistic traits, mood dysregulation, I believe I covered that earlier, physical aggression, and social aggression compared to control participants. In educational domains, individuals with childhood ADHD attained lower average levels of formal education and performed lower on neurocognitive measures of working memory and verbal fluency. In measures of adaptive functioning and physical health, adults with childhood ADHD reported higher perceived stress and lower emotional well-being. They also demonstrated higher average body mass index values, worse sleep quality. It's a funny thing with ADHD. Very common to experience delayed sleep onset, or it's like delayed REM sleep onset. I'm gonna look that up. There is a delayed onset of which some persons with ADHD may experience in having difficulty actually getting to sleep and then getting good quality like REM sleep and waking up feeling rested. It takes longer for some persons with ADHD for the systems associated with the body, like cooling down, communicating to all of its physiology that, hey, we're winding down to go to sleep now, we're safe, we can shut down, problems can wait. So many systems associated with delaying those systems associated with getting to the point of going unconscious for 6 to 10 hours. They also demonstrated higher than average body mass index. Okay, I read that part. Additionally, adults in ADHD childhood group were significantly more likely to be currently prescribed ADHD medication compared to both siblings and control participants. The sibling control group demonstrated adult functioning that was largely comparable to the control group across most measures. In childhood, the siblings of children with ADHD are at an increased risk of ADHD-related traits and show an intermediate neurocognitive profile compared to adults. Based on these findings, we expect siblings to also show more difficulties in adult functioning. However, we found few differences between siblings and controls in adulthood. Siblings also showed slightly elevated levels of self-reported ADHD traits and autistic traits, as well as slightly higher body mass index values compared to controls, but lacked major psychiatric or academic setbacks. Finally, although the siblings of children with ADHD share half of the genetic material as well as part of their childhood environment, these siblings generally did not have an increased risk of problems in adulthood. When comparing individuals whose ADHD persisted into adulthood, when comparing individuals whose ADHD persisted into adulthood against those whose condition remitted, specific patterns emerged. The persistent ADHD group displayed the highest risks for major depressive disorder, internalizing problems, severe stress, and poor sleep quality. However, adults whose childhood ADHD had remitted still showed lower educational attainment and lower cognitive scores compared to control participants, suggesting long-lasting impacts on learning. This is where accommodations come in. The research has emphasized that despite overall group differences, there is substantial diversity in how adults with childhood ADHD fare. However, there is variability in the functioning of adults with childhood ADHD, and the majority of adults with childhood ADHD show functioning comparable to controls. There seems to be a subset of adults with childhood ADHD particularly experiencing impairment, which seems to be partly linked to continued ADHD diagnosis. Which I think also stands to reason, modifying the behavioral interventions applied to promote exactly what's needed: emotional regulation, cognitive development, how one self-soothes, finding relatable skills that are attractive to manage those things, gamify them if needed. Several limitations could be considered when evaluating these findings, and we always acknowledge the limitations and weaknesses of a study so they can be done better the next time. The study sample was comprised exclusively of individuals of Caucasian descent living in the Netherlands, right? Which limits how well the conclusions apply for more diverse racial or cultural populations. Selective participant dropout occurred over the 18-year period. It was a long time. I would expect a lot of dropouts, as only a portion of original childhood cohorts were successfully reevaluated. Difficult to imagine tracking that many people across that long of a time span. The retained childhood ADHD group had slightly higher childhood symptom severity than those who dropped out, meaning the results may reflect outcomes for individuals with somewhat more severe early symptoms. Additionally, cognitive testing was conducted remotely over video calls rather than in a standardized physical laboratory, which might introduce minor variations in home testing environments. In other work of my doctoral research, we additionally looked at specific medication outcomes, sex and gender differences in the long-term outcomes of childhood ADHD, the long-term outcomes of stimulant treatment in childhood, and attempted to identify predictors for long-term outcomes. Future research should investigate the risk and protective factors that are related to the differences in functioning adults with childhood ADHD and identify which individuals are at most risk. This knowledge can help improve the prevention or intervention strategies. That's what I'm hopeful for. Adjusting what modalities are available and supported by data that provides a better outcome. Okay. This is what we just covered. I'm going to put that in the MH Research channel. I have one more article on Phubbing. We talked about Phubbing before. Remember Phubbing? It was maybe 6-7 months ago we talked about Phubbing. It wasn't that long ago. I'll save this one for later. It's interesting, but that's not the one I wanted to access. 9 recent studies that reveal the hidden psychology of American politics. It is very interesting to review social dynamics there, but not what I want to get into tonight necessarily. Phubbing, though, we talked about another article that I guess kind of coined the term phubbing and where we see that in relationships and where it causes distress in couples. But for those that don't know, phubbing is living in your phone problematically when you could be, and perhaps ought to be, giving regard, paying attention, meaningfully engaged with your partner or partners, as opposed to doing this while watching a movie together or co-regulating. This would be phubbing. This would be phubbing. I'm phubbing you right now. I'm phubbing you right now. How do you feel about that? I'm phubbing you right now. What a wonderful meme. Good memes here, good memes, and you can't see them. I'm phubbing you. This is phubbing you. It doesn't feel great, right? When one partner frequently ignores the other in favor of a smartphone, the resulting sense of neglect is linked to reduced harmony within the household and distress in the bedroom. A recently published survey of 343 married women reveals that individuals who perceive higher levels of digital distraction from their partners also report greater levels of sexual frustration and lower overall family peace. Phub at your own peril. Phub at your own peril. Our romantic partners often set the tone for our broader domestic lives and personal well-being. A phenomenon known as phubbing occurs when someone snubs a person they are physically with by looking at a smartphone instead of meaningfully engaging with them. Researchers note that for a romantic bond to feel secure and fulfilling, couples require periods of undivided attention, rather than merely sitting in the same room. When devices constantly interrupt face-to-face time, the excluded partner can feel rejected or undervalued. Over time, these negative feelings can seep into other areas of the relationship. Feeling ignored might erode emotional intimacy, which is often a necessary foundation for a fulfilling sex life. You consider what you're communicating to your partner. I'm not saying you, anybody doing this, say what one is communicating to their partner. If they are so, perhaps willfully or unwittingly distracted by the device that they might already spend a lot of time with. It speaks to priority, it speaks to something that would be very difficult to not personalize without having a conversation about it, you know? Which also speaks to a problem that can arise with a lot of couples if they don't practice, you know, like meaningful engagement and don't fall into like pitfalls of mind reading and expecting one to interpret one another's needs and wants, desires by nonverbal cues. And sure, nonverbal cues work sometimes, but unless you've verbalized it, it's really hard to know how to meet the need necessarily. Having open a dialogue if there is some frustration there and catching it early, but worth correcting. I would expect there to be some friction there. A team of nursing researchers based in Turkey set out to map how these distinct aspects of domestic life connect. The research group at Gaziantep Islamic Science and Technology University led the investigation. They recognized a gap in scientific literature regarding how digital behaviors echo through both sexual well-being and broader family life. Their team conducted their research in a cultural environment where patriarchal expectations are common and sexuality is considered a taboo subject. That's unfortunate. Women in such environments often carry the primary responsibility for maintaining emotional harmony at home. The researchers aim to understand how a modern stressor like a smartphone distraction might interact with traditional social pressures to affect women's daily lives and romantic satisfaction. To gather their data, the research team recruited 343 married women through a local family health center. The participants ranged from age 20 to 66. The researchers administered a series of established questionnaires during face-to-face interviews. Surveys measured 3 core areas of women's lives. One questionnaire calculated participants' perception of how frequently their husbands engaged in digital avoidance. That's what it can seem like is an avoidant behavior. Which for some can become like a maladaptive, like self-serving, self-protective type of mechanism. A second assessment measured household harmony, divided in factors like overall satisfaction and deep distress. A third survey evaluated sexual distress, tracking negative emotional responses, such as frustration, anxiety, or guilt related to the women's intimate lives. The survey results demonstrated a consistent pattern linking screen time to interpersonal friction. Not the kind of friction they'd rather have. I'm horrible. Women who reported higher levels of partner phubbing also reported measurably lower levels of general satisfaction in their family lives. As perceived digital distraction increased, the women's self-reported feelings of deep distress in their home escalated in tandem. Consequences extended directly into the couple's physical relationships. The data indicated that increased partner phubbing was associated with higher levels of sexual distress. When the researchers modeled the statistics, they found that perceived partner phubbing and overall family peace accounted for nearly a third of the variation in the women's sexual distress scores. The patterns observed in the data align with several psychological frameworks, including attachment theory. This theory proposes that adults require mutual support and emotional validation to feel secure in their romantic bonds. Avoiding a partner by staring at a screen often registers as a form of detachment. When one individual uses a phone to create emotional distance, it interrupts the person's sense of belonging and security. The authors also viewed their findings through the lens of gendered social norms. In many societies, women assume the bulk of emotional labor and household management. When traditional pressures combine with a distracted partner, the mental load can actively suppress sexual desire. The data supported the idea that a lack of engagement in the living room translates to physical discomfort or a lack of interest in the bedroom. And one of the saddest things I'm taking away from this is that a partner might be on the phone saying, "ChatGPT, what's wrong with my wife?" And then ChatGPT just reinforces that well, in fact, there's nothing wrong with the individual asking ChatGPT what's wrong with my wife, and in fact, the person inquiring is the victim. They're offloading the emotional labor it takes to, I guess where I'm going with that is a really shitty joke and referencing offloading one's own emotional labor to the very real experience that we need to have of navigating interpersonal conflict. Uncomfortable as it is, we must not mistake discomfort for distress. Uncomfortable as it is, we definitely benefit from approaching that discomfort together if it's there in any relationship. The research team suggests that women with advanced education might hold different expectations for relational engagement, making them more sensitive to digital distractions. Financial stability appeared as make sure I'm reading that correctly. Financial stability appeared to act as a buffer against some of these relational strains. Participants whose household income exceeded their regular expenses reported the lowest levels of perceived partner phubbing and the lowest levels of sexual distress. These financially secure women also reported the highest levels of family peace, suggesting that economic comfort might reduce underlying household tension. Conversely, women living with chronic illness face steeper relational challenges with the study sample. The group reported elevated perceptions of partner phubbing with greater sexual distress alongside lower household peace. That's really painting a picture of, again, recognizing that we are biopsychosocial creatures. Stressors of all sorts impacting the household's kind of ability to be mindful with one another. You know, all of the external stressors that one absorbs throughout a day can definitely make an impact on eroding one's otherwise self-led sensibilities of being kind of the person their partner needs, much less being the person they need to be in that relationship. So, of course, like so many things where there's greater resource security, the less discomfort there is. The authors theorized that chronic health conditions might often require enhanced emotional support, making a partner's withdrawal into a screen feel particularly acute or neglectful. Also that. That's how you feel when you want to interact with people and everyone's on their phone, but interesting to see what's confirmed in research. Yeah, it's not, it's funny to say it's not normal while also being like a pretty ubiquitous behavior. Like we all carry our phones, but we also know that there's data to support like the presence of a phone even in like a classroom now. And I'll preface this with correlation isn't causal, but like presence of a phone in like a classroom can potentially reduce cognitive faculties for those needing to focus for exams or just the lesson in general. Same thing applies in social settings. Granted, that's gonna fluctuate at the mercy of how much kind of individual tolerance one has for being comfortable and secure away from their phones while they're interpersonally relating with others. Because, you know, there's a lot of excitement to be found in that screen. Some don't tend to go very long without one. These demographic nuances outline a modern behavior like missed a key word there. Demographic nuance outlines how a modern behavior like excessive phone use interacts with individual life circumstances. According to the data, the negative feelings generated by a partner prioritizing a device do not remain isolated in a single moment. Instead, perceptions of rejection seem to resonate through the home environment, ultimately influencing how tension is handled and how intimacy is experienced. When the mathematical model showed a robust connection, the study of design limits how the results can be interpreted. Research used a cross-sectional approach, meaning the data was collected at a single point in time. This type of snapshot can highlight correlations, but it cannot prove cause and effect. I think we say that at least once a stream. Correlations, not causal. It remains possible that pre-existing family distress or sexual dissatisfaction drives individuals to retreat into their smartphones rather than the phone use initiating the distress. Another limitation involves reliance on self-reported questionnaires. The researchers only measure the women's perception of their partner's phone use without tracking actual screen time through the digital recording methods. A person's mood or current relationship satisfaction might skew how they interpret their reported partner's actions. Yeah, there's quite a bit more to look at there. The participant pool was also restricted to women from a single geographic in Turkey. The authors acknowledged that different cultural backgrounds, societal structures, and gender expectations could alter how individuals perceive and react to digital distraction. Men's experiences with a partner phubbing were not evaluated in this study. However, we've looked at a previous study that covered the same thing, and it's bidirectional. Though I think that, speaking of bi, I think that study, the one we looked at before, I'm pretty sure one of the criticisms there was it only looked at heterosexual couples. I don't think it looked at any other type of coupling behavior or gender identities in that. Just realized how loud that music was. Oh my god. Maybe there. Moving forward, the researchers recommend that future investigations use longitudinal designs tracking couples over months or years. Hey, the previous study recap we looked at, that was longitudinal. But we saw the pitfalls with that is that some people drop out over time because of the time it takes to reevaluate them. Observing relationships over time could help identify whether poor communication causes smartphone withdrawal or if screen addiction initiates the communication breakdown. They also suggested incorporating insights from both partners to capture a complete picture of the relationship dynamic. I think that's why they mentioned attachment styles earlier, because if someone is more anxious and avoidant, they're not going to seek to remedy conflict necessarily in a healthy way. Or in a productive way. For now, the findings offer a practical takeaway for individuals navigating modern relationships. The simple act of putting down a device and offering undivided attention might serve as a basic form of relationship maintenance. Creating dedicated boundaries for digital devices could represent an easy step toward improving household memory, harmony, and lowering interpersonal stress. To that end, I suppose, there's a great signal to send to the person you're communicating meaningfully with that sometimes you put that phone down and put it behind you or leave it in the other room. And I think that's going to communicate you're prepared to listen outside of maybe even busting out a notepad. I don't know. There's that. I will put that now in the research channel in the Discord. How we doing on time? 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 An hour and 10 over. Okay. Well then, I think it's safe for me to run our first break. When we come back, we'll pick up where we left off with Mario Sunshine. Alright, so I'm going to play some tunes for you to tingle by, and of course, pre-break preamble, ask you to scan your body meats from your toes to your tingles, wherever you may identify them. Check in with your internal, external sensory needs, and give yourself all that you need. Top off your beverages, move your body meats. I will see you in 3 minutes. Also catch X on your Fridays.